The cafe was full when it happened. Not packed, just full enough that every person inside had somewhere to look and chose, in that fraction of a second, to look at the same thing, a sound. One sound. The kind that doesn't need explanation. Then a room holding its breath. Coffee going cold. A conversation stopping mid-sentence 3 tables away. A young woman near the window with her hand frozen over her phone. Recording, already recording, though she hadn't made the conscious decision to press the button yet. And a man sitting at a table near the window. Worn coat. Work-ruined hands flat on the surface. Head turned slightly from the impact. Not looking up. Not at her. Not at the room full of witnesses. Just down like he'd been here before. Like the world had put him in this exact position enough times that he'd learned the geography of it. Like he knew, without needing to confirm it, that the room was watching, and would go on watching, and would eventually look away, and that the only thing required of him in this moment was to remain exactly who he was. What nobody in that cafe knew, what the woman with the phone couldn't see from where she was sitting, was the scar on his wrist, and what that scar had already survived. 3 years earlier, on a November highway outside Chicago, Ryan Mitchell was still the kind of man who believed the worst thing that could happen to him had already happened. He was wrong. But he didn't know that yet. Ryan woke at 5:13 every morning without an alarm. Not because he was disciplined. Because the radiator in the bedroom wall of their apartment on Paulina Street made a knocking sound at 5:12 every morning, without fail, like something trapped inside the pipes trying to get out. He'd complained to the building manager twice in the first month after moving in. After that, he stopped complaining. Easier to just wake up. Easier to get moving before the silence of the apartment reminded him of everything it used to contain. He'd learned that about silence. It wasn't empty. It had weight. It pressed down on the specific places where a life used to be and now wasn't. And it was more efficient to be in motion before it found those places. So he moved, 5:13. Feet on the cold floor, into the kitchen before he was fully awake. The overhead light was too bright for that hour, so he didn't use it. Just the small lamp on the counter, the one Maisie had picked out at a garage sale the previous spring, because it had a yellow shade, and she said yellow was the color of breakfast. She was 6. She had opinions about everything. He loved that about her more than he had words for, which was saying something for a man who had once been paid to calculate exactly the right word for every structural specification he wrote. Oatmeal first. Steel cut, not instant. Laura had taught him the difference, and now he couldn't go back. Medium heat, slow stir. While it cooked, he sliced half a banana, not the whole banana. Because Maisie would eat half and declare herself full with the certainty of someone who had never once been wrong about her own appetite. And he had learned not to waste the other half on optimism. He set the bowl at her spot at the table, spoon on the right side. Cup of milk, not too cold, because cold milk made her teeth hurt, and she would tell him about it at length and with significant feeling. Then he stood at the counter and drank his coffee black and didn't think. That was the discipline, actually. Not the waking up. Not the cooking. The not thinking. The choosing every single morning to be present in the motions instead of somewhere else. He'd gotten better at it across the past 3 years. Not good. Better. There was a difference, and he was honest enough with himself to know which side of it he was on. The backpack was already by the door. He'd packed it the night before. Blue folder for reading. Red folder for math. The yellow one for the science worksheet she hadn't finished, and had promised him she would definitely finish in the morning, which they both understood to mean she hadn't finished and wouldn't, but the promise had to be made, and he had to let her make it. He unzipped the bag, checked, confirmed, zipped it back up, added her water bottle from the counter, added the small packet of crackers she liked, tucked into the side pocket where she'd find it at lunch, and it would feel like a surprise even though it was always there. She found it every day. It was still a surprise every day. That was the thing about Maisie. She held on to wonder with both hands. She hadn't learned yet to be guarded about it, to perform the mild disinterest that older people developed as a form of self-protection. Ryan intended to protect that in her for as long as he possibly could, which he understood, on some level, meant protecting her from fully understanding what their life actually looked like from the outside. The apartment was small. 2 bedrooms, though the second barely qualified. The floors were original wood from when the building was put up in the 70s, which sounded charming until you understood that original wood in a Pilsen walk-up meant warped, uneven, cold in winter, in a way that came up through your socks, even through 2 pairs. The kitchen window looked out onto the alley. The living room window looked onto the street, which was fine except that the street light outside was positioned at exactly the angle to throw orange light into the room all night, unless you closed both layers of curtains. And closing both layers of curtains made the room feel like a closet with furniture in it. He'd put up Maisie's drawings instead of art. Covered the walls in them, framed some with tape, hung others with the small command strips that didn't damage the paint, because losing the security deposit wasn't something he could afford right now. Houses with too many chimneys. A dog they didn't have. A purple elephant she'd been working on in stages for 6 weeks, adding details each time, which meant it currently had 4 trunks, because she'd changed her mind about trunk placement repeatedly and didn't believe in erasing decisions. A drawing of the 2 of them holding hands, Ryan identifiable only because he was taller, and Maisie had given him a serious expression. While she herself was grinning so wide, the smile nearly went off the edge of her own face. On the refrigerator, held up by a magnet from a pizza place that had closed 2 years back, was a drawing of 3 people. Ryan, Maisie, a figure drawn in yellow, bright yellow, almost aggressive in its yellowness, the way a child uses color when they want to make something unmistakable. No features on this one, just yellow, like a sunburst in human shape. He never moved that one. The accident was not something Ryan talked about, not because he couldn't, not anymore. In the first year, he genuinely couldn't. The words would start and then his chest would do something that made speaking impossible. Some compression he couldn't control, like his body was physically refusing to let the sentence complete itself. But he'd sat in a chair across from a grief counselor at the community health center on Ashland for 14 months, and he'd talked through it enough times that he could now hold the shape of it without being swallowed by it. He just chose not to. Because the people who asked didn't actually want the full weight of it. They wanted the summarized version, the safe version. And Ryan had learned that giving people the safe version was a kind of mercy. For them, maybe. For him, definitely. It cost less to deliver and left him more intact afterward. The safe version. 3 years ago. November. Wet roads. A truck crossed lanes on the 290. Laura didn't survive. Maisie was 3, home with a babysitter, asleep before the phone rang. The real version was longer, and it lived in his body, not in words. The scar on his left wrist was part of the real version. He'd reached through the shattered driver's window after impact. His door wouldn't open. The frame had buckled inward, and the glass had opened a line from his wrist toward his elbow that needed 11 stitches and left a ridge of scar tissue that never fully flattened. He didn't remember doing it. He only remembered being outside the car, and then inside the ambulance, and there being a lot of blood that he couldn't account for, and a paramedic saying his name over and over, in a tone that told him the news before anyone said it out loud. He still wore long sleeves most days, not to hide it, just because it was Chicago and most days were cold enough to make long sleeves the obvious choice. But in the warmth of a building after coming in from outside, the sleeve would shift sometimes, and the scar would show. He never explained it when people noticed. He just moved on, because there was always something to move on to, and moving on was a skill he'd developed to the point where it no longer required conscious effort. It had become simply the direction he faced, after Laura. The engineering job lasted 4 months. He'd been a structural engineer at a mid-size firm downtown, Beacon Structural Group, 7 floors above Walker. A place with good coffee and the kind of precision culture he'd been built for. The work required a particular type of patience that most people found tedious and Ryan found grounding. He liked the weight of it, the responsibility, the way a calculation either worked or it didn't, and the answer was always knowable if you were rigorous enough. Grief was not rigorous. Grief was not knowable. He missed 2 deadlines in the months following the accident. Then a third. He sat through a performance review. where his manager, a decent man, who was visibly uncomfortable with the whole conversation, used phrases like diminished capacity and opportunity to recalibrate with a kindness that was still, at its core, a countdown. One more quarter like this, the implication was clear, and the decision would be made for both of them. He tried. He genuinely tried. He came in early and stayed late and drank too much coffee and sat in front of his drafting software for hours, with the cursor blinking at him like a slow, patient accusation. The work that used to feel like breathing now felt like translation, like he was doing it in a language he'd mostly forgotten and couldn't reconstruct on the fly when it mattered. He didn't make it to the next review. After that, he applied for engineering positions 11 times across 2 years. 11 applications, 6 first-round interviews, 2 second rounds, 0 offers. The gap in his resume was the problem, not the gap itself, which was explainable, but the way he couldn't explain it in a form that fit into a box. What do you say in the space that asks for your reasons? My wife died, and I came apart. And it took me a long time to put myself back together, and I'm not entirely sure I've finished. You can't say that. So you say something careful and insufficient, and the person across the table nods and makes a note. And you both know there won't be a callback. He stopped after the 11th. Not stopped trying, stopped applying for engineering positions specifically, because if there was a particular kind of diminishment in sending out that form of hope and receiving that particular form of silence repeatedly. And he had a 6-year-old at home who needed him functional, more than she needed him idealistic. So, 3 jobs, morning shift, package delivery for a small logistics company out of a warehouse off Western Avenue. Physical, repetitive. The kind of work where your body learned the motions and your mind could be partially elsewhere, which was either a mercy or a hazard depending on the day and what was waiting in the elsewhere. He was good at it. Fast, accurate, rarely needed to recheck an address twice. His supervisor, a compact, efficient woman who communicated almost exclusively in nods and clipboard taps, had once told him he was the most reliable driver on her morning roster. He'd held on to that for a week. Took it out occasionally when he needed it. Afternoon shift, appliance repair, freelance, sourced through an app that connected handymen with households that needed things fixed. He had the technical background for it, and the manual dexterity and, more importantly, he had the particular temperament the work required. The ability to enter someone's home and be patient with their anxiety about the broken dishwasher and diagnose the issue calmly and fix it without making them feel foolish for not having fixed it themselves. He was good with people who were having a bad day. He understood it from the inside. Evening shift, 3 nights a week, building maintenance and cleaning for a commercial office complex on Michigan Avenue. Elevators, common areas, the kind of invisible labor that kept a building functional and presentable, while everyone who worked there went home and slept. He finished at 11 on those nights. Home by 11:30, up again at 5:13. He'd done the math once on what this cost him in sleep and decided it was better not to revisit the calculation. What kept him from the edge of it every single day was Maisie at the window. She had a habit of waiting for him. He'd asked her once not to, told her she should be reading or drawing or doing whatever she'd been doing before she heard the key in the lock, but she ignored this instruction with the comfortable completeness of someone who had already weighed his preference against her own and made a considered decision. She stationed herself at the living room window when she heard him on the front walk, so the first thing he saw when he looked up from the sidewalk was her face in the glass. Not looking at him yet, looking for him, scanning the street in both directions, with the focus of someone performing an important task. And then, the moment she spotted him, the expression that broke across her face, like the first light of something that had been waiting, like it was the best part of the day. Like he was the best part of the day. A man can keep moving under a lot of weight when someone looks at him like that. And Ryan Mitchell had learned, across 3 years of keeping moving, that this was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the whole thing. Wednesday. Mid-December. The kind of cold Chicago does in winter that isn't just temperature, it's personal. A wet wind off the lake that found the gap between your collar and your scarf and installed itself there. The kind of afternoon that made you understand why people left for Phoenix and question every life decision that had led you to remain. Ryan had finished a repair job at 2:15. A washing machine in a 6-flat-off Damen, older unit, needed a new actuator and a drive belt. And about 40 minutes of work that he'd done in 35, because the hallway outside the apartment was cold and the building owner was hovering with the specific energy of someone who has decided that observation speeds up the process. He packed his tools, collected the payment through the app, said thank you to the owner, who said thank you back with the particular relief of someone whose problem has been solved and who no longer needs to think about it. He had an hour and 10 minutes before school pickup. The delivery job was done for the day. The evening office shift didn't start until 6. Somewhere in the middle of those blocks of time was a man who had once had a career and a home and a life that felt like a single continuous thing rather than a series of shifts separated by transit. And that man occasionally surfaced in the gaps between obligations with something that wasn't quite longing and wasn't quite grief and didn't have a name he'd found yet. He needed to be somewhere warm. Somewhere he could sit without being required to be anything specific. Just long enough to let the afternoon settle before he went back to being everything Maisie needed him to be by 3:30. The Café on Halstead. A small place called Meridian, the name in small letters above the door. Not a chain, the kind with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu that changed with the seasons, was 2 blocks from the repair job. He'd been in once before, months ago, for the same reason. It was the kind of place that didn't track what you were or weren't. You could be a person between things and no one made it their business. He pushed through the door, warm inside. That specific warmth of a room that's been heated all day, dense and close and smelling of coffee and something baked, cinnamon maybe. The kind of smell that reaches the part of your brain that still knows how to be comforted before the rest of you catches up. 4 tables occupied, 3 not. Behind the counter, a young man. Name tag said Brian, early 20s. The kind of easy manner that came from genuinely liking his job rather than having performed it into habit. Looked up and nodded in the way of someone who was glad to have another customer without being excessive about it. Sit wherever. Ryan looked around, spotted the table near the window. Corner, slight separation from the others, a view of the street without being directly in traffic. He pointed at it. That one okay? Yeah, go ahead. Brian was already reaching for a mug. What can I get you? Black coffee. No sugar. Coming up, Ryan set his tool bag down beside the chair, sat, put his hands on the table. His coat was old, a dark navy wool thing he'd bought 4 winters ago that was still structurally intact, but had developed that particular quality of worn clothing, where it had stopped being a coat and become a condition of his appearance, like the calluses on his hands, or the way he moved through spaces slightly more efficiently than the space required. His work boots had a seam coming loose at the left toe that he'd been meaning to get resoled for 2 months. His hands were the hands of someone who worked with them. A knuckle slightly swollen from a job 2 weeks back, a callus at the base of each finger, the faint permanent scent of machine oil that no amount of hand soap could entirely reach. He looked out the window at the people moving fast along Halstead, heads down against the wind, everyone with somewhere specific to be. And he felt the particular relief of being still when the world was moving around him, closed his eyes. Just for a second, he didn't register the door opening. He registered the drop in temperature as cold air came through it, then the sound of heels on hardwood. Precise, even, the kind of stride that didn't adjust itself for the space it moved through, as if the space had been informed in advance to accommodate it. Then voices, low and tense, and the particular shift in a room's atmosphere that happens when someone enters who expects the room to reorganize itself around their arrival. He opened his eyes. The woman was maybe 43, 44. Dark hair pulled back with the neatness of someone who doesn't make decisions about their appearance carelessly. Charcoal coat, clean lines, the kind of tailoring that was easy to overlook until you understood what it cost to achieve that kind of understatement. A phone pressed to her ear, a conversation she was concluding without looking at the person she'd walked in with. Behind her, A large man in a dark jacket moved with the controlled economy of someone professionally trained to assess a room before fully entering it. Not theater. The real version, the kind of attention that came from having been in situations where not paying it had consequences. Ryan looked back at the window, the woman's voice, from the phone. I told her an hour ago that I needed that table confirmed, not estimated. And now you're telling me. A pause, then lower, tighter. Find out which location she gave you and call me back in 2 minutes. The phone came down, a beat of silence, then movement toward his table. He felt it before he understood it. The shift in trajectory in his peripheral vision, the sense of something coming his way with a specific destination in mind. He turned. She was standing 3 feet from him, looking at him the way people look at something that isn't where it's supposed to be. Not anger yet. The preliminary stage. Assessment, categorization, the rapid formation of a conclusion. His chest tightened as he met her eyes and felt, in that fraction of a second, the full gap between what he looked like and what he knew himself to be. This table is reserved, flat. Certain in the way of someone who has never had a reason to be uncertain about the things she wanted. He kept his voice even. The gentleman at the counter sat me here. My assistant reserved it this morning. I didn't make a reservation. He told me to sit wherever I liked. She looked at him for a moment, at the worn coat, at the tool bag on the floor, at the hands. He watched her do it. The read, the categorization, the conclusion that arrived faster than any evidence could support it. You need to move. He was tired. He had another hour before pickup, and then homework and dinner, and 3 days of bills he hadn't fully sorted yet, and his left knee ached from crouching in a cold hallway for 35 minutes, and he was very, genuinely tired. But he kept his voice level because Maisie was 6 and was learning how her father handled the world, even on the days she wasn't in the room to watch. Ma'am, I was directed to this table. I'm happy to ask the gentleman at the counter to clarify. Brian had appeared at the edge of the counter, sensing the shift, not yet intervening. His expression was the expression of someone who knows exactly what happened and is calculating whether saying so will help. She didn't look at Brian. She was still looking at Ryan, and something moved behind her eyes. Not reason, not reconsideration. The opposite. The particular decision of someone who has spent enough time being immediately accommodated that any form of resistance feels like aggression. I don't have time for this. Her hand moved. He didn't see it coming. Not in the way of being caught off guard, in the way of not believing it was actually going to happen. Not in a cafe on a Wednesday afternoon in December. Not to a man who had simply sat down at a table where he'd been told to sit and asked for a cup of black coffee and wanted to be warm for 40 minutes before he went back to being everything. The sound was sharp, clean. It cut through the cafe the way a word cuts through a room when it should never have been said. Every conversation stopped. Ryan's head turned with the impact. He held it there a moment, held very still, tucked the way you hold still when something has happened that your body needs a second to process before your mind decides what to do about it. Then he brought his head back to center. He looked at the table. Not down in defeat, down in the particular stillness of a man who has learned, through a specific kind of repeated experience, that some moments don't require a response. That the dignified thing and the quiet thing are sometimes exactly the same thing, and that he had a daughter to pick up in an hour, and he would not let whatever this was become something that changed the shape of the next hour, or the hour after that. The cafe was a held breath. Sandra Weston stood very still. Her hand had returned to her side. Something had left her. Not guilt, not yet, because guilt required a moment of reflection she hadn't arrived at. But the energy that had preceded the action was gone now, and what remained in its place was a kind of startled interior quiet she hadn't expected to feel. Her own hand felt strange to her. The large man behind her stepped forward. George Adler had been in difficult rooms before, 8 years with Sandra. Before that, 12 years in various security and protection roles across Chicago. Corporate clients, private individuals. One stretch with a firm that did executive protection work before he decided he was finished, with airports and motorcades, and the particular loneliness of standing in lobbies while other people lived their lives. He was 52. broad through the shoulders. His face had settled into something that read as permanently watchful, without being threatening, the way certain men's faces did when they'd spent enough years paying close attention to everything. He stepped forward now, not to intervene. The moment for intervention had passed approximately 2 seconds ago, and he was not someone who pretended otherwise. But because his instinct was to position himself between his employer and whatever consequence was about to arrive. Because consequences were his professional territory. Because in 8 years he had learned to read the room in the aftermath of Sandra's decisions, and right now the room was reading badly in every direction. He came around to the side of the table, and he saw it. Ryan's left arm had shifted when his head turned with the impact. The sleeve of his coat had ridden up a few inches at the cuff, just a few. Enough, the scar ran from the wrist toward the forearm, a raised line of scar tissue, faded to silver white, the color that takes years to arrive after an injury. Long, clean at the edges in the way that surgical repair left edges. Not a work injury, not something acquired gradually. Something that had happened in one specific moment and had required someone who knew what they were doing to close it properly. George's eyes locked on it. And something happened in his chest that he hadn't been expecting, a particular sensation. Not recognition, not quite. Because the mind doesn't move that fast, and certainty doesn't arrive before examination. More like the feeling of a piece of music from somewhere deep in your past reaching you, before you can place it, your body, responding to it, while your brain is still looking for the file. He went still, because 2 years ago, in May, at a charity gala in Joliet, a fundraiser for a children's hospital expansion held at a venue off the Des Plaines River. The kind of event where George was background furniture in a good suit. A fire had started in the catering kitchen, electrical, fast-moving, because the ventilation in the kitchen was old and the evening was dry and fires in those conditions don't negotiate. The alarms went off. People moved. Hotels train for this. The crowd was the kind with enough presence of mind to follow instructions without creating a secondary problem. The evacuation was, for the most part, orderly. George did not make it out in the first wave. He had doubled back. He still wasn't entirely certain why. Some professional instinct about a secondary corridor, a check that didn't need to happen, the kind of habit that had kept him employed for 20 years, and on this one occasion, turned badly wrong, and found himself in a service hallway as the smoke thickened faster than he'd anticipated. His eyes were burning. His lungs were beginning to make the decision for him. He got low. He kept moving. He made it about 30 feet before his legs decided they were done. Later, in the ambulance, then in the hospital, then across the weeks that followed. The EMT told him he'd been found at the hallway exit, that the door had been forced from outside, that a man had pulled him out and was gone before the first responders reached him. A hotel staffer who'd witnessed the last part of it from the parking lot gave a description to the fire investigator. Medium height, dark hair, moved fast and low, had a scar on his left forearm that she'd noticed because he'd pushed his sleeves up in the heat. The scar was already old before that night, she said, already healed to that particular color. George had requested a copy of the fire investigator's report the following month. He'd kept it. He'd thought about the person described in it, off and on, for 2 years, not with the weight of an obligation he couldn't discharge. More the way certain things settle into you, when they don't have anywhere else to go. The open account of someone who did something for you, and didn't stay to be thanked, and can't be found. He stood beside the table in Meridian on Halstead and looked at the scar on Ryan Mitchell's left wrist and felt the 2-year-old memory surface with a clarity that surprised him. Sandra was already moving. She'd stepped back from the table, her phone out again, pressing a contact. Her assistant, her face arranged in the shuttered expression of someone who had done something they weren't prepared to examine immediately and was using the motion of work to avoid the examination. Which location did you book? Her voice was controlled, professional. The voice people use when they need to not be in the moment they're standing in. Ryan was sitting very still. His head had come back to center. His eyes were on the table. The coffee Brian had poured was on the counter, forgotten. Brian had withdrawn behind it, reading the room and choosing the only position that made sense, which was stillness. No one in the cafe was speaking. They were all doing the particular work of pretending they hadn't seen what they'd seen, which required more ongoing effort than the seeing had. George looked at Ryan. At the scar, at the table with the $5 bill, Ryan was already reaching into his coat pocket to place on it. At Sandra. With her back partially turned, her phone already converting the problem into someone else's logistical error, he did not speak, not yet. Because there were things he needed to think through before he said anything to anyone, and because in 8 years he had developed a clear understanding of when to be articulate and when to wait. And this was a moment for waiting. But something had locked into place in him, something that was not going to unlock on its own. Ryan reached into his coat pocket and put a $5 bill on the table. His coffee was still on the counter, unmade. He thought about asking for it. Decided against it, not from defeat, not from anything that could be called surrender, but from the clear-eyed recognition that the best use of the next few minutes was to walk out of this room and get to his daughter, and let the day become the next thing, instead of staying inside this one. He picked up his tool bag. Stood. For a moment, just a moment. He and George were at the same level, close enough that the larger man could have reached out and stopped him with almost no physical effort. George did not reach out. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at Ryan with an expression that Ryan noticed but didn't have the bandwidth to interpret. He registered it and let it go. Ryan moved toward the door, past the other tables, felt the room's attention follow him without anyone making it obvious. Brian looked up from behind the counter, and their eyes met, and Brian looked like he wanted to say something and hadn't found the right words, so he said nothing. And Ryan gave a single nod. Not about what had happened, just the nod of a person leaving a place, and pushed through the door into the cold. The wind hit him immediately. He stood on the sidewalk for 2 seconds and let it. His cheek still registered the impact. Not pain. A heat that wasn't fading quite as fast as it should. A physical record of what had happened that his body was keeping, even as his mind was already doing the work of setting it aside. He thought about Maisie at the window. He thought about the 7 blocks to school. He started walking. Inside the cafe, Sandra ended the call. She'd learned, on the call, that her assistant had given her the wrong address. Not by much. 1 block over, a different storefront. The actual reservation was at a place with a blue awning that Sandra passed every Tuesday on her way to the parking structure. The table she'd believed was hers had not been hers. The man she'd told to move had been sitting exactly where the counter employee directed him. She stood with the dough in her hand, and this knowledge sitting somewhere between her sternum and her throat, occupying space. She did not look at George, because she knew. She was not someone who was slow to arrive at uncomfortable conclusions, and she was not someone who required an error to be restated before she understood it. She knew. She had known, if she was being honest with a precision she rarely applied to herself, from about 30 seconds into the confrontation. When the counter employee's face went a certain way, and she'd chosen to override what that face was telling her, because the override felt easier than the alternative. She had done something she should not have done, because the man had a tool bag and an old coat in hands that told her what she thought she needed to know about whether his account of things was worth the same as hers. She didn't say this, even to herself, in exactly those terms. The mind has its own protective architecture. But the knowledge was there, underneath, in the place where things accumulate when you're not ready to look at them directly. Reservations, at the place on the corner. Her voice was level, the voice she'd used in board meetings since she was 28, and understood that level and professional were a better shield than almost anything else she could construct. "I know," George said. She looked at him then. Briefly. He was watching the door through which Ryan had left, and his expression was something she hadn't seen on him very often in 8 years, which was part of what made her look. "George, ready when you are." He turned toward the door without looking back at the table, or the $5 bill still on it, or the mug still on the counter. The investor meeting went as it needed to go. The man named Connors liked data and had brought his own. Sandra answered every question. She anticipated 3 of them before they were asked. She committed to a follow-up report with a timeline that was aggressive but achievable. She shook hands at the end and said the correct things, and walked out with George behind her and got into the car. The city moved past the window. The table was on the wrong block, she said. Yes, she gave me the wrong address. She did. A beat. I confirmed it this afternoon. The city continued. A school letting out. A man on a bicycle moving fast between stopped cars. A kid in a red jacket running to catch up with someone ahead of her. He was sitting where the counter employee told him to sit. George from the front. Yes. Silence. He didn't do anything wrong. George didn't answer this one. Which was, in its way, the most precise answer available. Sandra looked out the window for a long time. The school was gone. The bicycle, too. Do you know how many meetings I had this morning? George's eyes in the rearview mirror were steady and revealed nothing. It's not an excuse, she said. Not to him. More to the window, or to herself, or to the version of herself that needed to hear it stated clearly. I know it's not. I'm not offering it as one. He said nothing. She looked down at her right hand in her lap, turned it over once. Set it down. I need you to find out who he is. George's eyes came to the mirror. Held there a moment. I'll see what I can do, he said. And then, quieter, in a register she hadn't heard from him before, steady still, but carrying something beneath the steadiness that she couldn't immediately name. There's also something I need to tell you, but not right now. Tonight after the Connor's notes are filed. When there's time to do it properly. Sandra looked at his reflection. George Adler was not a man who said, I need to tell you something, and meant anything small by it. All right, she said. She looked back out the window. The afternoon was already going dark at the edges, the way December afternoons in Chicago did. The light pulling back before 5 o'clock as if it had somewhere more important to be. Street lights were clicking on in sequence ahead of them. She thought about the sound the table made when the $5 bill landed on it. She thought about a man who had looked down, not at her, not with anger, or with the gratifying display of inward feeling that would have allowed her to feel something other than what she was feeling, but simply down, the way a person looks down when the world does what they've come to expect it to do. She filed it away. Then, 2 blocks from the building, she stopped filing it and let it stay. Somewhere in Pilsen, 7 blocks from Meridian Coffee, a man was walking toward an elementary school with his head down against the wind, and the heat on his cheek was fading, and he was thinking about crackers and soup, and the specific way his daughter's face looked when she spotted him coming up the front walk. He was not thinking about the cafe. He was thinking about Maisie, because Maisie was the direction he'd learned to face. Neither of them knew yet that the afternoon's reverberations were still moving outward, the way all things move outward from impact, finding shapes in the distance that neither person standing at the center could yet predict. George knocked on the study door at 9:47. Not the main entrance to the penthouse, the study specifically, which meant he already knew she was still at the desk, still working through the Connors follow-up, still using the forward motion of productivity to keep something else from surfacing. 8 years. He knew her patterns the way a navigator knows weather. Not by reading conditions in the moment, but by having watched long enough to feel the pressure change before the clouds arrived. She said, "Come in," without looking up. He came in, closed the door behind him, stood. She finished the sentence she was writing, saved the document. Then she turned her chair to face him, because George, standing in a doorway at 9:47, with his hands at his sides, and that particular quality of stillness meant whatever was coming, required her full attention, and not a divided version of it. "Tell me," she said. He did. He told it straight. No preamble, no arrangement of the facts to soften their arrival, no filter for what he thought she could or couldn't handle. That was one of the things she'd trusted about him across 8 years. He delivered information. The way you wanted, information delivered when it actually mattered, which was without the editorial layer of someone deciding in advance what you needed to be protected from. He told her about Joliet, the venue in May 2 years prior, the charity gala he'd been covering as a freelance assignment when his schedule had a gap, the fire that started in the catering kitchen, the smoke in the service hallway, the 30 feet he hadn't been able to finish on his own. He told her about the man, the one who'd forced the hallway door from outside, pulled him to the parking lot, was gone before the first responders reached George. He told her about the witness, the hotel staffer in the parking lot who'd given a description to the fire investigator. Medium height, dark hair, moved fast and low. A scar on the left forearm, old and healed, silver white, noticed because the man had pushed his sleeves up in the heat. Sandra listened without moving. Then George said, "The scar on the man's wrist in the cafe this afternoon, it matches what she described," and the room went very quiet. She could hear the building's climate system, the faint ambient hum of a city that never fully stopped. Her own breathing, which she became aware of in a way she hadn't been 30 seconds earlier. "You think it's the same person. I think the probability is high enough that I can't justify not telling you." She looked at him for a long moment. "And you noticed this when his sleeve moved, after. The word sat between them, carrying everything they weren't going to address directly about what after referred to. She stood up from the desk, walked to the window. Chicago at night was a composition of light and geometry that people paid architects specifically to achieve, and she had stopped seeing it as beautiful about 3 years into living above it, and had started seeing it as simply the view. The backdrop, the thing that was always there when she needed something to look at while her mind was working somewhere else. "You didn't say anything to him." "No, why not?" George took a moment. Not hesitation, consideration. She knew the difference. "Because I wasn't certain," he said. "And because whatever I said in that room, in that moment, was going to be used by one of you to do something. I needed to understand what the right something was before I handed either of you the information." She turned from the window. Something moved in her chest that she had no clean name for. He was sitting at the right table. "Yes, she gave me the wrong address. I confirmed it this afternoon. The reservation was 1 block over. He was where the counter employee directed him." A pause. "Brian, the employee. I spoke with him briefly on my way back to the car. He confirmed he told the man to sit wherever he liked and gestured at that table specifically." She held all of this, the full shape of it. The man in the worn coat who had been sitting exactly where he was supposed to be, who had said so calmly and been disbelieved, then struck. Who had looked at the table and not at her. Who had left a $5 bill for a coffee he never received and walked out without raising his voice once. The voice she used in boardrooms was gone. What was left was something older and less managed. "Find out everything. I want to know who he is. I already started." George reached into his jacket and produced a folded piece of paper. Handwritten, which was unusual for him. He set it on the edge of the desk. "His name is Ryan Mitchell. 38. Structural engineer by training. Degree from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He worked for Beacon Structural Group downtown. 5 years. Solid record. No disciplinary history. He was let go in the months following a traffic accident on the 290 that killed his wife. Her name was Laura. She died roughly 3 years and 4 months ago. He has a daughter, 6 years old." A pause, deliberate. "He currently works 3 jobs. Morning delivery for a logistics company out of a warehouse on Western. Afternoon appliance repair, freelance. 3 evenings a week, building maintenance on Michigan Avenue." Sandra looked at the paper but didn't pick it up. 3 jobs, she said. 3 jobs. She sat back down, not at the desk. In the chair beside it, the one that faced the room rather than the screen. The one she never used. Because sitting in it felt too much like not working. And not working was a condition she didn't easily tolerate. "There's something else," George said. "Tell me." He had patents registered through Beacon. 4 of them, filed during his tenure. 1, filed in his final year there, covers a thermal insulation framework for residential structures in high-weather variable climates. Specifically designed for regions where temperature swings across seasons create significant stress on standard insulation systems. Low material cost, adaptable implementation. Beacon shelved it when he left. Never licensed it, never developed it, never released the rights back to him. "It's been sitting untouched for 3 years. He paused. "I had our head of engineering look at the specification summary this afternoon. Her assessment, viable. Better than viable. She said it addresses a gap in current residential construction practice that nobody in the mid-market has solved cleanly. Sandra was quiet for a moment. He went from filing patents to cleaning office buildings. Yes, she didn't say anything more. Easy. She looked at the view she had stopped seeing as beautiful and tried to locate something in it that would tell her what kind of world allowed that to happen to someone without noticing or objecting. The city had no answer. It never did. She sat with the water glass she'd brought from the kitchen and hadn't touched, and she let the night do what nights did, which was make the things you weren't ready to very difficult to look at, to keep avoiding. Ryan didn't sleep well, which was not a new condition. He lay in the narrow bed in the apartment on Paulina and stared at the ceiling and did the thing he usually managed to avoid doing, which was running the afternoon backward and forward looking for the version where he'd handled it differently. Not better necessarily, just differently. Said something more precise. Said something less. Stood up instead of staying seated, or stayed seated in a way that conveyed something other than what it apparently conveyed. Chosen a different cafe, or checked his watch and decided to just sit in the parking lot near school with the engine running and the heat on, except the car's heating was unreliable on cold days, and the school didn't open the lot to waiting vehicles before 3:15. Except he had done exactly what made sense. He'd gone somewhere warm between shifts and sat at a table where he was directed to sit, and a woman who'd kind of mourning, and a woman who'd had the kind of mourn that turned everyone around her into collateral, had looked at him and made a decision in about 4 seconds. And he'd looked at the table, which was the part he couldn't find the right framing for. Not defeat, he was clear about that. He knew it wasn't defeat. But he also knew what it looked like from the outside, had felt the room's reading of it, and there was a specific exhaustion in knowing that the version of strength he'd developed, the quiet kind, the kind that didn't perform itself, was also the kind that read, from certain angles, like something it wasn't. He was still awake at 11:30 when his phone buzzed on the nightstand. Number. He looked at it for 3 seconds. Unknown numbers at 11:30 were telemarketers working odd hours. Wrong numbers, occasionally his delivery company's dispatch when there was a route adjustment for the morning. He answered. Mr. Mitchell, a man's voice. Low, measured. Not aggressive and not apologetic either. The voice of someone who had made many calls in his life that required a specific kind of tone and had learned how to find it. My name is George Adler. You don't know me, but we were in the same cafe this afternoon. Ryan sat up. He didn't speak for a moment. The apartment was very quiet around him. From down the hall, the soft sounds of Maisie sleeping, small sounds, the sounds of a person deep in some specific interior landscape, something he'd listened for every night for 3 years, with the particular attention of someone who understood what it meant for that sound to be there. I know who you are, Ryan said. Careful. Level, I know you do. I'm not calling on her behalf. I want that to be clear before anything else. A pause. I'd like to come speak with you. In person. Not tonight, whenever's convenient for you. There are things I should have said in that room and didn't. And that's on me to address. Ryan looked at the ceiling. The orange glow from the streetlight bled around the edge of the curtain in the way it always did. What things? Better said in person. Then, before Ryan could respond, I can come to you wherever you're comfortable. You don't have to go anywhere. You don't owe me anything. I'm asking something about that last part. Not a pitch, not maneuvering towards something. Just a man who had apparently decided he owed someone something and was trying to find a way to pay it tomorrow, Ryan said. 2 o'clock. I'm at a job before that and I have pickup after. 2 o'clock, George repeated. Address? Ryan gave it to him. Then he said, You were standing right there. The sentence wasn't an accusation. It was an observation, stated plainly, containing a question inside it that George apparently wasn't going to try to deflect. Yes, George said. I was. Neither of them said anything for a moment. 2 o'clock, Ryan said again, and hung up. He lay back down. The radiator made its sound. Outside, a car moved slowly down the street, and its headlights swept across the ceiling and kept moving. He thought about what kind of man called at 11:30 at night to say he'd failed to do something he should have done, and was volunteering to account for the gap. Mute. He thought about whether that kind of man was trustworthy or whether he was simply guilty and looking for somewhere to put it. He decided he'd find out tomorrow, because there was nothing useful he could determine about it, at 11:30 in a cold apartment, and his alarm wasn't going to adjust itself. And Maisie had a test in the morning on the water cycle. Erosion, evaporation, the slow, patient work of natural forces that she had not, as far as he could tell, studied sufficiently for. He closed his eyes. In the penthouse on Michigan Avenue, Sandra was not sleeping either. She sat at the kitchen island with a glass of water she'd poured and wasn't drinking, and the handwritten paper from George and her laptop open to the Connor's follow-up. She wasn't reading, and she thought about the overlap between what she knew and what that knowledge cost her. She had built Weston Tech across 14 years on a specific theory of herself. The theory was this: she did not make mistakes that came from carelessness. She made mistakes that came from imperfect information or from impossible trade-offs, and those were the acceptable category, the kind you acknowledged, corrected, extracted learning from, and moved through. She was rigorous. She was disciplined. She had the work ethic of someone who had had nothing and knew precisely what the absence of everything felt like, because she had lived in it from the age of 11 until she'd built her way out, the foster system from 11 to 17. 2 families that were functional in the technical definition of the word. One that wasn't. A succession of social workers whose caseloads were too large for any of them to actually see her as a specific person, which she had understood even at 12. With a clarity that surprised the adults around her when she expressed it. She hadn't been angry about it. Anger required believing you deserved better, and no one had yet given her the architecture for that belief. She'd just been practical. Understood the available resources were insufficient, determined to become a resource for herself. Filed everything else under, cannot currently be solved. It was a good system. It had served her. It had made her successful and effective and occasionally feared, which she didn't dislike, and it had also made her someone who walked into a cafe in Chicago on a Wednesday afternoon and struck a man she knew nothing about because the day had been difficult and he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and her brain had processed his appearance and reached a conclusion faster than her better judgment could catch up. She picked up the handwritten paper, opened it. George had written it by hand because some information had a weight that required being held differently. She understood this the same way. She understood most things about how he operated, which was through years of paying attention. Ryan Mitchell, 38, structural engineer, University of Illinois, 5 years at Beacon Laura, 3 years and 4 months, 3 jobs. A daughter named Maisie, 6 years old, and at the bottom, in George's deliberate block print, thermal insulation patent. Filed during final year at Beacon, shelved on departure. Still viable. She stared at those last 2 words for a long time. She had a patent on the intellectual property shelf of a company that had cost more to build out than most people made in a decade. And that patent had been developed by someone who was currently cleaning the same category of building on Michigan Avenue at 11 o'clock at night. She couldn't figure out how to hold both of those facts simultaneously without one of them making the other worse. So she sat with the water she wasn't drinking and let the night work on her, the way nights worked on things that needed working on. George arrived at 2 o'clock exactly. Ryan had the door open before the knock finished, because he'd been watching from the window. Not anxiously, just with the attention of a man who prefers to know what's arriving before it gets there. He'd watched George park the dark SUV 1 spot down from the building's entrance, which he noted as the choice of someone trying not to be conspicuous about it, filed it. George came up the front steps, with his hands visible and his posture doing the deliberate work of not being imposing, which for a man that size required some active management. He looked like what he was, a professional, attempting to be a person in a moment that required personhood more than any other skill he had. Ryan stepped back to let him in. George stopped just inside the door and looked at the apartment the way people looked at spaces when they were trying to understand them rather than assess them. The drawings on the walls, the backpack by the door, the small lamp with the yellow shade on the counter. You said you weren't here for her, Ryan said. He didn't offer coffee. Not coldness. Just the recognition that performing ordinary hospitality when there was a specific reason for this meeting would have been its own kind of dishonesty. I'm not. George turned from the walls to face him. I want to start with, you were right. You were at the correct table. She was given the wrong address by her assistant. I know, flat. I know you know. I'm saying it out loud because you deserve to hear it stated clearly by someone who was standing in that room. George held his position, not crowding the space, not retreating from it either. I should have stepped in before it reached what it reached. I made a calculation that the situation was going to de-escalate on its own, and I was wrong about that, and I'm not going to find a cleaner way to say it. Ryan looked at him, the particular skill of looking at someone without letting the look become a position. Why are you here? He said, genuinely asking. 2 reasons, George said. The first is what I just said. The second is going to take longer. Ryan pulled out the kitchen chair across from where George was standing, sat, gestured at the chair on the other side. Invitation enough, George sat. Joliet, he said. May. 2 years ago. Ryan went still, not the stillness of recognition, or of being caught, or of alarm. The stillness of a man who is suddenly paying a different kind of attention. The kind that engages when something from a specific part of your past is about to be opened by someone else who wasn't supposed to have access to it. There was a fire, George continued, a charity event at a venue off the river. I was there on a freelance security assignment. I made a poor decision in a service corridor, and I couldn't reach the exit on my own. He kept his voice level, not minimizing, just refusing to perform distress about something he'd already fully processed. Someone got me out. I was mostly down by then. He was gone before I came around. He reached into his jacket and produced a small notebook, opened to a specific page, slid it across the table. Ryan looked at it. A handwritten transcription. He could tell from the format and the phrasings that it had been taken from an official report. A witness description, medium height, dark hair, moved fast and low in the smoke. Left forearm above the wrist, a scar, healed, raised, silver white. Already old before that night. Ryan looked at the description for a long moment. Then he looked up at George. Where did you get this? The fire investigator's report. Public record. I requested it about a month after. I've had it 2 years. Why, the question wasn't hostile. It was the question a man asks when he needs to understand the motivation before he can trust anything that follows from it. George's hands were flat on the table, open, because someone did something for me, and I never got to acknowledge it, he said. That has sat with me. It has been sitting with me for 2 years. Ryan looked at the scar on his own wrist. The move was unconscious. His eyes just went there for a second, a reflex, and came back. I was running deliveries that covered Will County that day, he said. Slow, choosing words not to hide anything, but because this was a story he had never told anyone, and the telling of it required some care. I came off the interstate, and I could see the smoke from a distance. There were people outside, and someone near the road said a man was still in the east corridor. He paused. The door mechanism was stuck from the outside. I got it open. George was very still. I don't know if it was you, Ryan said. I didn't see the person's face clearly. There was a lot of smoke and I wasn't taking inventory. I got someone out, I got myself out, and then there were sirens and I left. A beat. I had a route to finish. Something happened in George's face. Not what people called breakdown. The man wasn't constructed for breakdown, but a release of something specific, the kind of tension that had been held in a particular place for 2 years and now had somewhere to go. The scar, George said, from the night my wife died. I went through the window trying to reach her, the glass. He stopped. Started again. I didn't know the extent of it until later. George absorbed this. Didn't try to fill it with anything. They sat for a moment in the kind of quiet that forms between 2 men who have both spent time on the underside of things and understand what that kind of quiet is for. Then Ryan said, Can't tell her. George looked at him. The scar, Joliet, any of it. Ryan's voice was steady. Certain. If she comes to apologize, it's because she knows she was wrong. Not because she owes a debt to someone who did something 2 years ago. I won't be owed. I won't be a story she tells herself to make the accounting easier. He held George's gaze. If she can look at what happened in that cafe and understand it without needing me to be something exceptional, then it means something real. If she needs me to be a hero to justify caring about it, then it doesn't mean anything at all. George looked at the table between them. Then back at Ryan. That's an uncommonly principled position, he said. It's the only one I've got. A silence. I'll respect it, George said. What you've told me stays here. He held Ryan's gaze. But there's something else, and this one I'm not keeping from her, because it has nothing to do with Joliet. Ryan waited. She knows your work history. The degree, the tenure at Beacon, the patents. She found out last night. George leaned forward slightly. Beacon shelved your thermal insulation framework when you left. It's been sitting there unused for 3 years. No development, no licensing, no release of rights back to you. Sandra had her head of engineering look at the specifications. Her assessment, the framework is viable and addresses a real gap in mid-market residential construction that nobody has solved cleanly. Beacon looked at it through the lens of commercial real estate and saw a narrow market. Residential is a different calculation entirely. He paused to let this settle. Sandra wants to speak with you. Not because of Joliet. She doesn't know about Joliet. Because the work is real, and she is not someone who passes on work that is real, regardless of how she came to know about it. The kitchen was quiet. The radiator ticked in the wall. Outside, a bus moved down Paulina, its hydraulic brakes hissing at the stop, in the particular way of buses that had been running the same route long enough to have developed opinions about it. Ryan looked at the notebook on the table. The witness description, the old words on the old page. Then he looked at his hands. She can send me an email, he said. If she has something to say, she can send me an email and I'll read it. George nodded. He stood from the table, folded the notebook back into his jacket. He looked at the apartment one more time. The drawings covering the walls, the yellow lamp, the careful organization of a space that was working hard to be enough. And then he looked back at Ryan. For what it's worth, he said, and his voice had moved out of professional and into something less managed, you handled yesterday better than most people could have. Ryan met his eyes. It wasn't about handling it, he said. I just had somewhere to be. George took that, held it for a moment, then he nodded once and went to the door and let himself out. The email arrived at 7:14 that evening. Ryan was at the kitchen table with Maisie and a multiplication worksheet. The sevens, which she had identified as personally aggressive in a way that the other numbers were not, as if the sevens had made a specific decision to be difficult, and she had taken it somewhat personally. He heard the notification on his phone, glanced at the sender domain, unfamiliar, and set the phone face down on the table. He finished the worksheet, all of it. He ran Maisie's bath and sat on the edge of the tub while she narrated an elaborate ongoing story about an underwater civilization of frogs that had developed strong philosophical positions on mathematics, a story that had been running in installments for 3 weeks now and showed no signs of reaching a conclusion. He was present for all 20 minutes of it. Then he got her into bed, read 2 pages of their current book. A girl who could communicate with horses, a premise Maisie had evaluated carefully before declaring it realistic. Then 3 pages because she asked, and he agreed, because the evenings were the part of the day he didn't abbreviate, if he could help it. He kissed her forehead. He turned off the light. He sat down on the couch. He picked up his phone. The email was 8 sentences. No formal opener. No preamble. Mr. Mitchell, my name is Sandra Weston. You know what I did yesterday. I'm not going to dress it up or explain it away or offer you the version of an apology that is really just an explanation wearing formal clothes. I was wrong. You were in the right seat, the right cafe, and treated in a way you did not deserve, and that I am not in the habit of justifying to myself. Then, I've seen your engineering work. The thermal insulation framework you developed at Beacon. I've also seen what Beacon did with it, which is nothing, which is a waste. Then, I'm not writing to offer you something as payment for what happened. I'm writing because I looked at your work and it's real, and because I would like to talk, and because you deserve the choice to say no. Then, at the end, I'll be at Meridian Coffee on Thursday at 10 if you'd like to meet. I'll be there whether or not you come. You don't owe me a response. He read it twice. Then he set the phone down and looked at the middle distance for a while. He was 38 years old. He had a structural engineering degree that had cost him 4 years and $26,000. In loans he'd finished paying off 2 years before Laura died. He had 5 years of real work, real output, the kind of problem solving that required a specific kind of mind, and that he had been genuinely good at. He had 4 patents, 3 of which Beacon had absorbed into their intellectual property archive and done nothing with, and the 4th. The 4th, the one that was apparently not as finished as he'd believed, had been filed in his last year there, when he'd been trying to hold everything together simultaneously and produce something that mattered, and which he'd been told on his way out was interesting but not commercially viable. That phrase had lived in a specific folder in the back of his mind for 3 years, in the section labeled Things I Was Told About My Value, that I haven't fully decided whether to believe. He thought about Maisie's drawing from last spring, the house with a room added for him, with a window, because she wanted him to be able to look out while he worked. He looked at his hands, he picked up his phone, opened a new email, typed, Thursday at 10, nothing else. He pressed send. Then he put the phone face down on the couch cushion and went to bed. Thursday morning, Meridian Coffee was quiet at 10. Brian was behind the counter. He looked up when Ryan came in and said nothing about Wednesday, which Ryan appreciated more than he would have said. Sandra was already there. Different table from Wednesday, a round one near the center of the room, 2 coffees already on it, both untouched. She stood when Ryan came through the door and then seemed to reconsider the standing and committed to it anyway. Different coat from Wednesday. Dark green, less structured, her hair down instead of pulled back. He noticed these things without processing them as signals. He was here to have a specific conversation and understand what it actually was before he made any decisions about it. He sat. She sat. Thank you for coming, she said. I was in the neighborhood, which was not true. He'd used one of his 2 remaining flex days on the delivery route to make this time work. He didn't tell her this and didn't intend to. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup, not warming her hands, steadying them. He recognized the gesture. I said what I needed to say in the email, she said. I don't want to spend this time restating it. Then don't. The work, she said. And she put a folder on the table. He opened it. Inside, a printed copy of his patent specification. The full technical document, which he hadn't read in 3 years, and which looked, on the page, strangely foreign, the way your own handwriting looks unfamiliar when you encounter it after a long interval. Beside it, a single page in a different handwriting. Someone else's notes on his own specifications. Clear, technically fluent, written by someone who had read the document carefully rather than summarizing from a description of it. At the bottom of the summary page, underlined, feasible at current material costs. Residential application in climate variable regions. Midwest housing stock specifically is the correct market, not commercial. Not commercially marginal, commercially underutilized. He looked at that last phrase for a moment. Who wrote this, he said. My head of engineering, Thomas Graham. 9 years with me. He doesn't write things down unless he's prepared to stand behind them. Ryan set the folder down. What are you proposing, he said. Sandra leaned forward slightly. There's a project. Community housing development on the south side. 12 units, mixed income, grant-funded structural phase starting in spring. We've been looking for an engineering lead for the thermal efficiency component for 4 months. The site has irregular wind exposure from the north and a hard budget ceiling that rules out standard commercial-grade insulation approaches. She paused. Your framework addresses both problems specifically, and I don't think anyone else knows it well enough to implement it correctly under real field conditions. Ryan said nothing. I'm not offering you charity, she said. The word landed cleanly, not defensive, just clear. I'm offering you a contracted position, scoped to the project, independent engagement. If the work meets spec, there's more work after. If it doesn't, the contract ends. No other consideration in either direction. He looked at the folder. His own specifications, printed in a room he'd never been in, evaluated by someone he'd never met, determined to be something other than what he'd been told they were when he left. He thought, about what George had said, that she didn't know about Joliet, that this was not a debt being discharged. Sitting across from her now, watching her present, the work, the way you presented something, you actually believed in, rather something you were performing belief in, he found this more credible than he had when George said it, which didn't make the situation simple. It made it the complicated version of real, which was its own thing entirely. I need to think about it, he said. I know. That's not a no, I understand the difference. A pause. There's one more thing, he waited. Beacon still holds the patent, she said, which means implementing the framework raises intellectual property questions that need resolution first. I have an attorney looking at it. Beacon is in the middle of a restructure, significant staff reductions, contracts under review across the board. The attorney believes there's a navigable path to a licensing arrangement, possibly at terms that work for both sides. I'm not promising a specific outcome, but I have access to legal resources you don't currently have, and I'd like to use them towards something that makes sense. Careful. Not a guarantee. Just the door opened. Ryan looked at her, not at the folder. At her, this was the moment, he understood, where you decided whether someone's offer was power dressed up as generosity, or whether it was what it presented itself as being. He had learned, across 3 years of learning things the direct way, that these two things were distinguishable if you paid the right kind of attention. He paid the right kind of attention. People often can't see what they've decided not to see, he said, and sometimes that runs in both directions. Sometimes you spend long enough looking at a ceiling that you stop recognizing it as a ceiling and start accepting it as the sky. She looked at him. I'll give you an answer by Friday, he said. Friday, she agreed. He stood. She stood. Neither of them reached for a handshake, and neither of them found the absence of one awkward. He picked up the folder. She let him take it without comment. He walked to the door. Brian caught his eye from behind the counter and gave a small nod. Not the nod of Wednesday, not loaded with anything from that afternoon. Just the nod of a regular, acknowledged. Ryan stepped out into the cold. December in Chicago didn't adjust itself for the things that happened inside its cafes. The wind was still the wind. The 7 blocks between Meridian and Maisie's school were the same 7 blocks they'd always been, but the weight of the morning was sitting differently than the weight he'd walked in with. Not lighter, not yet, just oriented differently. Like something that had been pressing uniformly from one direction had redistributed itself, and he didn't know yet whether that was better or worse, and wouldn't know for a few more days. He put his head down, he walked. George had watched the meeting from the SUV parked half a block south. Sandra hadn't asked him to stay. She'd said she was going in alone, which was unusual enough that he'd driven her and then remained anyway, because 8 years and because certain habits existed for good reasons. Through the cafe window, he could make out the shapes of the two of them at the table. The folder opened between them, the posture of two people who were not yet trusting each other, but were at least occupying the same conversation, which was more than could have been said 48 hours earlier. He watched Ryan come out, watched him button his coat against the wind and start walking north without looking back. He watched Sandra stay at the table. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and looked at the door for a moment. Then down at the table. Then she took out her phone. His phone buzzed. He's considering it. He'll have an answer by Friday. He took the folder. George typed back. That's a good sign. A pause. Then, is it? Not a question. The sound of someone trying to read a situation they weren't accustomed to, not knowing how to read. He typed. He took the folder. He could have left it on the table. A longer pause this time. Then, yes, he could have. George set the phone down and looked out the windshield at the space on the sidewalk where Ryan Mitchell had been standing 2 minutes ago. He thought about a service corridor in Joliet, smoke moving faster than expected, 30 feet that became impossible. He thought about a door forced open from outside, about a man who had a delivery route to finish and stopped anyway, who had done the thing and left without accounting for it. He thought about Ryan saying, in the kitchen of that small apartment, I just had somewhere to be. George started the car, pulled away from the curb, drove the half block to the cafe entrance. He thought, that man is going to say yes, not because of the money, Not even primarily because of the work, though the work was a real part of it. Because in an apartment in Pilsen there was a 6-year-old girl who had drawn her father a room with a window, and a man who had been carrying 3 jobs, and a grief that would have folded most people, and a patience that the world had tested repeatedly. That man was not going to say no to the first real door that opened onto the thing he'd been trained to do. He wasn't the kind of person who said no to real doors. George had established this within the first 4 minutes of sitting across a kitchen table from him. Sandra came out at 10:32. She got into the car without speaking, which was normal. He pulled into traffic. After 2 blocks, she said, "He told me people can spend so long looking at their ceiling that they stop recognizing it as a ceiling and start accepting it as the sky." George drove. "That's not nothing," he said. "No," Sandra said, looking out at Chicago moving past the window, her voice carrying the quality of someone sitting with something that was rearranging things in places she didn't usually allow things to be rearranged. "It's not nothing at all." Friday came. Ryan sent the email at 7 in the morning, before his delivery shift, before Maisie was awake. In the particular quiet of the apartment when the radiator had already made its sound, and the day hadn't yet started requiring anything of him. 4 words. "Yes. Send me details." He put the phone face down on the counter. He started the oatmeal, sliced half the banana, set the bowl at Maisie's spot, spoon on the right, milk not too cold. He looked at the drawing on the refrigerator, the 3 figures, the yellow sunburst shape that was Laura, held in place by the magnet from the closed pizza place. He looked at it a moment longer than usual. Then he turned to the stove, poured his coffee, and waited for his daughter to wake up. The contract arrived Monday morning, 12 pages. Clean language, no ambiguity built into the margins, the kind of document that had been written by someone who understood that the terms themselves were a form of respect. That clarity was not a hedge against trust, but the foundation of it. Contracted independent engineer. Project scope defined with specificity. Deliverables tied to measurable outcomes. Payment schedule structured around milestones, not around goodwill or continued relationship. A termination clause that ran in both directions with equal force. Weston Tech could end the engagement if the work didn't meet technical specification, and Ryan Mitchell could end it if the project parameters were altered, without his written consent. He read it twice at the kitchen table, his second cup of coffee going cold beside him. Then he called the number on the cover page, not Sandra's number, the general project line. A man answered. Thomas Graham. The same deliberate voice you expected from someone who underlined conclusions and meant them, who had been the handwriting in the folder. They talked for 40 minutes. About the South Side site and its specific challenges. About the wind exposure problem created by the gap between 2 existing structures to the north, and what that meant for the northwest face of the new building during a Chicago winter. About the budget ceiling and what it realistically constrained in terms of material selection. Thomas asked good questions, the kind that came from having read the specification carefully rather than having been briefed on it secondhand. Ryan answered straight, including the 2 areas where he wasn't yet certain and said so, and Thomas noted those with the sound of someone who found honesty about uncertainty more useful than performed confidence. At the end, Thomas said, "When can you get out to the site?" Ryan said, "What's your availability Wednesday?" which was how it began. Not with ceremony or speeches, with a site visit, and a man who knew how to read wind patterns in irregular terrain, and another man who knew how to ask the right questions about what he was looking at. He didn't tell Maisie right away. He turned it over in his mind the way he turned over everything that involved her, with the specific care of a parent who understood that how you framed something was sometimes as consequential as the thing itself. She was 6. She had strong opinions and a precise radar for when information was being presented in a shape designed to manage her response rather than inform it. He told her Thursday evening, after dinner, while she was drawing. He sat down across from her and said, "I got a new job." She looked up. Her expression was the careful calibration of cautious interest she deployed when she wanted more information before committing to a feeling. What kind? Engineering. Designing part of a building, she considered this. A big building? 12 apartments. For families who need them. She looked back at her drawing, the purple elephant, which had recently undergone a significant revision and now had a corrected eye situation that she had declared satisfactory. Is it good? Yeah, he said. It's a good job. She added a line to the elephant's trunk. Did you stop the other jobs? Not yet. The new one is part-time until I know how it goes. She nodded. Then, will you have an office? A desk at their building? Yes, with a window? He looked at her. She looked up. Boo needs a window in her room, she said, as if this were the natural continuation of the same conversation rather than a pivot. So she can see the neighborhood. I'm drawing it tonight. He sat there for a moment and let that be exactly what it was. Good idea, he said. She went back to the elephant. He went back to the dishes. Neither of them said anything more about it. But when he passed the table 20 minutes later, she had added a window to the drawing. And in the window, small and deliberate, she had drawn a figure, the taller one, the one with the serious expression she always used for him. Looking out, he stood there for a second looking at it. Then he put the last dish away and didn't say anything, because some things didn't need to be said to be understood. The South Side site was a vacant lot on a block that had been waiting for something for 11 years. Ryan could tell from the way the surrounding buildings held themselves. The particular lean of structures that had been carrying neighborhood load longer than they'd been designed for. Stress patterns visible at certain corners where wind loads had gone unmanaged across a decade of deferred maintenance. He walked the perimeter twice before Thomas arrived, made notes on his phone, photographed the corner exposures, the adjacent structures, the drainage gradient, across the lot, the orientation of the gap between the two buildings to the north that was going to create the channeling problem. Thomas pulled up at 8:15 and found Ryan already 60 feet into the lot, crouching at the northwest corner with a measuring tape. You've been here a while, Thomas said, since 7:30. Thomas looked at the notes already on Ryan's phone when he handed it over. Substantial notes for 45 minutes of solo work. She said you were thorough. Ryan stood up. She hasn't seen me work yet. She said you were thorough. Thomas repeated, with the slight precision of someone clarifying that the source of the assessment was reliable and the statement was not guesswork. I find myself inclined to agree. They spent 3 hours on the site. Ryan walked Thomas through the wind exposure logic in detail, the way the gap between the two existing buildings created a channeling effect in winter that would direct concentrated cold air at the new structure's northwest face at angles and velocities that standard Midwest residential spec didn't account for. The framework compensated for exactly this problem. Not theoretically, in the specific conditions of this site, this orientation, this gap width, this grade. Thomas listened, asked, listened more. His questions got more specific as the morning progressed, which was the sign of someone whose understanding was building in real time, rather than someone waiting for a pause to demonstrate that they'd been paying attention. At the end he said, the Beacon patent situation is going to create friction. I know. Sandra's attorney is already in contact with Beacon's legal team. The company is in restructure, significant staff reductions, contracts being renegotiated across divisions. The attorney's read is that Beacon has limited appetite for a protracted IP dispute over an asset they've done nothing with for 3 years, especially given the circumstances around your departure. She thinks a licensing arrangement is achievable. Reasonable terms, possibly faster than you'd expect. Ryan looked at the lot. At the space where 12 families were going to live, eventually, in something built partly from an idea he'd had 5 years ago in a downtown office, when he was still the version of himself that believed his ideas had somewhere to go. What does she need from me to move the negotiation forward? Just your written authorization to proceed. The attorney handles the rest. He looked at the northwest corner. Thought about families standing in the apartments above it come January, whether the insulation held what it was designed to hold, whether the math that had worked on his screen years ago would hold in actual conditions on an actual winter day. Tell her she has it, he said. Thomas made a note, then looked up. There's going to be a period where the situation between you and Sandra gets talked about inside the building. People know the basics. Not everything, but enough. It's going to affect how some people approach you initially. You should go in knowing that. Ryan looked at him steadily. People form assessments and update them. Work is work. Thomas held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. The nod of someone who has received an answer direct enough to be trusted and is satisfied with it. The first week at the Weston Tech engineering floor was not easy, not hostile, nothing overt, just the particular texture of a room that knew a story and hadn't finished deciding what the story meant. Eyes that tracked slightly longer than they needed to. Conversations that adjusted in volume when he walked by. Not going silent, just recalibrating. The institutional awareness of something complicated that no one had been given official language to address. He was accustomed to being the man people looked at and formed conclusions about without asking him anything. He had been practicing patience with this for 3 years. He did not let it change his output. He came in at 8 every morning. He left at 4, because 4 was school pickup, and this had been written into the contract as a non-negotiable condition that Sandra had agreed to, without comment or counter. He used the desk they'd cleared for him in the engineering bullpen. Not a private office, which was fine. He'd had an office before and found bullpens more useful. More information moving through them, easier to understand how a team actually functioned versus how it presented itself in meetings. He kept his head down for 3 days. Not in invisibility. He spoke when spoken to, contributed to the one cross-team meeting he was included in, and when a junior engineer named Alexis, Shim, Sosim, showed him the current thermal specification for the project, and he found 2 problems with the window placement on the south face that were going to create summer heat load issues nobody had accounted for. He said so directly and showed her exactly why on the drawing. She looked at the corrected version for a moment. Then, nobody caught that. The site orientation makes it non-obvious, he said. Accurate, not gracious. There was a difference. She fixed it. The following morning, she showed the corrected drawing to her supervisor with his name attached to the change, which she hadn't been required to do. He noticed that she had. By the end of the 2nd week, the texture of the room had shifted. Not dramatically, not the kind of shift that announced itself. Just the particular recalibration of people who had decided to update their assessment of someone based on evidence rather than context, which was the only process Ryan had ever been able to respect. The conversation stopped adjusting in volume. The eyes still tracked, but with different intent. He understood the process. He held no resentment toward it. It was simply how things worked, and the only position that made sense was to give people something worth updating toward. He did the work. The work was good. He ran into Sandra in the building lobby on a Thursday, 12 days after he started. Not arranged. He was crossing toward the elevator at the end of the day, coat on, and she was coming in from outside, still in hers, carrying a bag with the look of someone who'd come directly from somewhere else. They nearly missed each other entirely. Then they both looked up, a half-second of something. Not awkwardness exactly, but the necessary adjustment when 2 people who have had a specific kind of interaction encounter each other, in a context that is supposed to be ordinary, and are both navigating whether ordinary applies to them yet. She put her phone away. How's the site work going? Good. Thomas and I are finishing the northwest face specification this week. He mentioned you caught a placement issue on the south face, heat load from the window orientation. It was in the drawings once you looked at the site exposure correctly. She looked at him for a moment. The lobby was moving around them. End of the day, people with somewhere to be. The beacon negotiation is progressing, she said. The attorney thinks a preliminary agreement is reachable before the end of the month. Thomas mentioned it's likely to push the spring timeline by a few weeks. 3 weeks, probably. I wanted you to hear it directly. I can use the 3 weeks. There's a thermal bridge issue in the foundation interface I want more time to resolve anyway. She nodded. Then, after a beat, are you all right here? In the building. She paused, not struggling for words but deciding whether they were necessary. With the situation, he gave her the true answer rather than the convenient one. People are doing what people do. The work is good. She held his gaze for a moment with the expression of someone taking an honest answer at face value. which was, he realized, less common than it had any right to be. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. He got on the elevator. She crossed toward the executive corridor. 11 seconds of shared lobby. But something about those 11 seconds mattered in a way that 11 seconds shouldn't logistically be able to manage. Something in the fact that she had asked him directly, and he had answered directly, and neither of them had performed anything around it. At this particular point in both of their histories, the absence of performance was its own kind of signal, and both of them recognized it, without saying so. The Beacon licensing agreement came through on a Tuesday morning in January. His attorney, a soft-spoken man named David, whom Sandra's lawyer had recommended, and who had turned out to be exactly the kind of lawyer you needed for a negotiation involving a company in restructure and a claim with genuine but legally complicated merit, called at 9:45 with the terms. Beacon would license the framework for the South Side project and any subsequent Weston Tech community housing developments at a rate that was modest but real. Ryan retained all future rights to the framework outside those specified uses. Beacon received a quiet exit from a patent they'd been sitting on without value, which suited their restructure timeline. David walked through every term carefully, the way of someone who had spent 20 years understanding that the person on the other end of the line needed to actually comprehend what they were agreeing to before they agreed to it. Ryan listened, asked 3 questions, got clear answers. "Do you want a day to think it through?" David asked. "No," Ryan said. "I'm in." He called Thomas first, then sent Sandra a single line. Beacon agreement confirmed. Ready to move forward on the spring timeline. Her response came in 4 minutes. "Good. Thomas will coordinate from here." Then 30 seconds after that, a second email. "Thank you for being patient with the process." He read the second email twice. Patient wasn't quite the right word for what he'd been. Determined was closer. Quiet and stubborn and sometimes barely, but determined. He didn't correct her, because what she was reaching toward was something more than the specific word she'd landed on, and he understood the gap between intention and precision well enough to let it go. He wrote back, "The work makes it easy," which was true, and which was, he recognized, the most honest thing he could say about where he stood. Not about her, not about the distance they'd covered from a cafe in December to a licensing agreement in January, about the work. The thing that had been there underneath everything all along, the actual framework waiting to carry weight. February brought the groundbreaking, a small ceremony, the kind that existed primarily for the grant funders and the alderman's office, and the Residents' Association that had been advocating for the site for 8 years, which meant it was attended by people who genuinely cared about the outcome, rather than people who needed to be seen caring about it. Ryan stood with the engineering team in the February wind off the lake, which was not metaphorical cold but the real meteorological kind, personal and sustained, and listened to a woman from the Residents' Association say into a microphone that her daughter had been on the affordable housing waitlist for 2 years, that her daughter had 2 young children, and that one of the apartments in this building was going to be theirs. He stood there and listened to that, and felt something shift in his chest. Not relief. Something more structural than relief. Something more like, this is why the calculation always mattered. Not on the screen, not in the specification. Here, in the specific weight of specific people who needed the building to be warm and to hold. Maisie was there. He'd picked her up from school and brought her because he'd made a promise to himself. Unspoken, not recorded anywhere, just held. That she would see this. Not the ceremony, the site, the real thing, the empty lot with its survey stakes in the frozen ground that was going to become something. She stood beside him with her mittens on. She'd remembered them, which was not guaranteed, and looked at the staked outline of the foundation perimeter. "That's where the building goes?" she asked. "That's the shape of the first floor." She studied it for a long moment, working something out. Then, "It's bigger than I thought." "Buildings usually are," he said. "On paper they're flat. Standing inside the footprint is different." She thought about this. Then she stepped off the gravel path and walked carefully into the staked area, picking her way between the survey markers, with the concentration of someone navigating something important, and stood in the middle of what would eventually be the ground floor common hallway. She put her arms out to her sides. "I'm inside it," she said. "You are." She turned slowly, taking in the staked perimeter around her, the gray February sky above. Her father standing at the edge, watching her be exactly who she was in every moment she occupied. "It's going to be good," she said, not asking. "Yeah," he said. "It's going to be good." Sandra found them after the ceremony concluded, navigating the small crowd. The alderman's aide, Thomas, two people from the Residents' Association whose conversation she was working to conclude efficiently. She had the particular expression she wore when she was operating in official capacity while her attention was partially somewhere else. She reached them as Maisie was climbing carefully back over the survey markers, which required significant concentration, and received it. Maisie straightened up, brushed gravel from her coat, and looked at Sandra. "Are you the lady who hit my dad?" read Coble. Ryan felt the specific parental sensation of watching something happen that you cannot intercept and would not fully choose to intercept even if you could, because the honesty of 6-year-olds served purposes that adult diplomacy was not equipped to serve. And sometimes those purposes needed serving. Sandra crouched down. Not the crouch of someone managing a child. The crouch of someone who had decided this conversation deserved eye level and was going to give it that. "Yes," she said. No qualifier, no but attached to it. "I am." Maisie filed this. Her expression was the serious one she wore when information needed to be accurately recorded. "Why?" "Because I made a mistake. A significant one. Did you say sorry?" "I tried to." Maisie considered this with the thoroughness of a child who had already determined that trying to say sorry and saying sorry were related but meaningfully distinct events. "My dad says sorry has to go with fixing it." Sandra looked at her steadily. "He's right about that. Are you fixing it?" A pause. Not stalling. Genuine consideration. The kind that didn't cut corners. "I'm trying to," Sandra said. "I don't know yet if I've gotten there." Maisie seemed to find this acceptable, or at least honest enough to satisfy the question as asked. She looked at her father, then back at Sandra. "Boo has 4 eyes now," she announced, apparently satisfied that the primary business was concluded and they could proceed. Sandra blinked. "Who's Boo?" "My elephant." Maisie looked at Ryan. "Can I go look at the stakes again?" "Stay inside the orange flags," he said. She went. They watched her go, picking her way deliberately between the markers, arms slightly out for balance, with the focused intention of someone performing an important reconnaissance mission. Sandra stood up from the crouch. Something was in her face that she wasn't managing, a quality of being reached by something small that she hadn't prepared to be reached by. She watched Maisie move through the frozen lot. "She's something," Sandra said. "Yeah," Ryan said. "She is." A moment passed between them in the February cold. Not comfortable, not uncomfortable. The kind of moment that resisted clean categorization, because it sat at the intersection of too many different things at once: apology and work, and a shared professional address they now both occupied, and a 6-year-old who had just conducted a more direct accountability conversation than most adults managed across an entire relationship. "Sorry has to go with fixing it," Sandra said quietly. Not to him specifically, more like turning the sentence over in her hands to understand its weight. He didn't say anything. She said, "I'm working on the fixing part." "I know you are," he said. And because it was true, and because she deserved to hear the true version of it. It's showing. Spring came slowly that year. March was still winter in practice. April was undecided about itself. But by the first week of May, the foundation was poured, and framing had started, and the structure was beginning to be visible above the lot line, and Ryan stood on the site on a Tuesday morning, with the wind off the lake, no longer carrying the same personal hostility it had in February, and watched the framework rise. He visited 3 times a week, more when structural decisions required his physical presence rather than a remote review. He had a rhythm now. Desk work at Weston Tech on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Site visits Tuesday and Thursday. School pickup every day at 4, built into every schedule he kept, communicated clearly to every person who might ever need to reach him after 3:30. No one at Weston Tech tested that boundary. Not once. He had also, quietly, let the delivery job go in February, after the Beacon agreement, after the first contracted payment cleared, and he'd run the numbers 3 times and confirmed that the math worked without the 5:30 warehouse shift. It was the first of the 3 jobs he'd released in 4 years. He didn't mark the occasion. He texted his supervisor on his last day to say he wouldn't be returning, received a response that said, "Good luck to you, Ryan," in the tone of someone genuinely glad without being surprised, which was its own form of acknowledgement. The evening building maintenance job followed in March. He kept the appliance repair work, 2 afternoons a week. Not because he needed it financially, though it helped, because he was good at it and because the people whose appliances failed were real people with real problems, and there was a satisfaction in the directness of it. Broken thing, fixed thing, done. That balanced the longer, slower arc of the construction project in ways he hadn't anticipated needing but did. Maisie noticed the change in the evenings, not all at once, gradually, the way children notice gradual things, more attentively than adults usually credited them for. He was home before dark more often. He was less tired at the table. He had the quality, on certain evenings, of a man who had spent the day doing something that fit him rather than something that sustained him. And that quality was different in ways she registered without naming. She didn't comment on it directly. She just drew more elaborate things. The purple elephant acquired a complete background, a landscape, a sky with specific cloud formations, and a building visible in the distance that had, if you looked carefully, 12 windows across the first floor. He looked carefully. He didn't say anything about it. Some things you just let be exactly what they are. The article ran in late April, a local news site, the kind that covered Chicago neighborhoods with the attention of journalists who actually lived in them. The headline was not subtle. Weston Tech CEO hires man. She assaulted in Southside housing project. Community investment or damage control. Ryan read it on his phone at the site on a Thursday morning, standing in the wind near the northwest corner where the framing was going up. Thomas was 15 feet away doing an inspection. Ryan finished reading, put the phone in his pocket, and went back to the foundation interface calculation he'd been running before the notification came in. Thomas looked over. "You saw it. Just now. Sandra saw it last night. She wanted me to tell you she won't respond publicly unless you want her to." Ryan looked at the rising foundation, at the concrete that was going to hold 12 units through 40 years of Chicago winters. "I don't want her to. That's what I told her you'd say. The work is the response," Ryan said. Not as a line, as the accurate description of how he understood it. When those families move in, that's what it says. Thomas raised his phone and photographed the foundation corner. "Want to see the framing schedule for the northwest face?" "Yes, good. Come look at this." And they went back to work. He thought about the article twice more that day. Twice more than he'd intended. Not from anger, though something lived under the clarity of his response that might have been anger's quieter relative. But because the article demonstrated, with the precision of public record, how narrow the frame was through which the world would read the story of the past several months. Man assaulted, then hired. Clean causation. Damage control or genuine change? Pick one, assign the motive, file it under resolved. The actual shape of it was so much more complicated than that. The actual shape included a 6-year-old who drew her father a room with a window, a patent filed in the final year of a failing job that turned out to be real, a bodyguard who knocked on a study door at 9:47 because certain things sat wrong and required addressing, an email with 8 sentences and no performance in any of them. A foundation that was going to hold because the math was right. And the math was right because someone had cared enough to get it right years before anyone was paying attention. The article had none of that. The article had a headline and a shape that fit a scroll and moved on. He couldn't do anything about the article. So he went back to the framing schedule. In the 3rd week of May, Sandra came to the site unannounced. Ryan looked up from the northwest corner, and she was picking her way across the lot, coat open because May had finally committed to being spring, in boots that were not construction boots but were at least practical. Thomas wasn't there. Just Ryan and the crew, and now Sandra. She looked at the structure, really looked. Not the look of someone reviewing an asset, but the look of someone trying to understand the relationship between what was in front of them and what it was in the process of becoming. "How far out is the framing?" she asked. "Northwest face goes up next week. The rest follows through June." "It looks right," she said. He glanced at her. "What do you mean?" "I don't know exactly." She walked to the edge of the foundation and looked down at the poured concrete. "I've funded construction projects before. Usually I look at the schedule and the budget and the milestone reports. I don't usually stand on a site and feel like I understand something I didn't understand before I got here." She paused. "It looks like it's going to hold." He looked at the structure with her for a moment. "It's going to hold," he said. The crew was working the east wall. The particular percussion of a building being built rather than demolished, more forward-facing, more intentional. Sandra stood at the foundation's edge with her coat open in the May morning and looked like someone who had come to see something and was actually seeing it. He had been careful, across the months, not to let professional proximity become something else. Not from coldness, from clarity. He knew what the situation looked like from outside. He knew what the article had implied. He knew that a single misstep in either direction would retroactively recolor everything that preceded it in ways neither of them could fully control. So he had kept the work. And he had let what was real develop at the pace real things developed, which was slow and non-negotiable and not subject to anyone's preferred timeline. But standing here in May, with the structure going up and the math holding, and 12 units becoming visible above a lot that had been waiting 11 years, he felt the quality of something earned rather than arranged. Not between them, specifically, the whole of it. The way a thing that starts in the worst possible moment can travel, if the people involved are willing to travel honestly with it, towards something that carries more weight than its origin. Sandra turned from the foundation. "The families who are moving in," she said. "Do you know anything about them yet?" "Thomas has the waitlist files. I haven't read them." "That felt like their information." She nodded. "One of them has been on the affordable housing waitlist for 2.5 years. A woman named Carol. She was at the groundbreaking. She spoke at the microphone." He remembered her. The daughter. The 2 grandchildren implied, "I know who you mean." "Her unit is the southwest corner. 2nd floor." Sandra looked at the structure. "Your framework is going to keep her winter heating costs below what she's currently paying in a building without adequate insulation." He said nothing. "I wanted you to know that I knew that," she said. Simple. No performance in it. Just information delivered because it was true and she thought he should have it. That's all. He looked at the southwest corner of the rising frame. Thought about Carol standing in that apartment come January. The heat holding the way it was designed to hold. Something sat behind his sternum that didn't have a name but had a definite presence. "Thank you for telling me," he said. The building was finished in late September. Not precisely on schedule. 3 weeks of weather delays in August pushed the exterior work back, but close enough that the grant funders were satisfied, and the alderman's office could frame it as a success, which was fine. Ryan didn't care about the framing. He cared about the insulation values in the northwest walls assembly, which he checked himself during the final walkthrough, and which were exactly what the calculations predicted. The walkthrough took 4 hours. At the end, he stood in the ground floor hallway. The same hallway Maisie had stood in the middle of, at the groundbreaking with her arms out to her sides, and looked at the full length of it, complete now, real. The kind of real that had physical weight, that held heat, that was going to be someone's home for years. He thought about the framework sitting in a digital file at Beacon for 3 years, untouched. He thought about 11 job applications answered by silence. He thought about 5:13 in the morning, and the radiator's knock and the yellow shade lamp, and a small face at the living room window, looking for him before he came into view. He thought every single day of it was necessary. Not good, not all of it, but necessary. Because the man who designed that northwest wall assembly was the man those 3 years had made him, and that man was more careful about what held and what didn't than he had ever been before any of it began. Thomas came to stand beside him in the hallway. "Final sign-off next week," Thomas said. "I'll be here. You should also know, Sandra is going to propose expanding the program. 2 more sites in the next funding cycle. She'll want you to lead the engineering on both. Ryan looked at the light fixture above them. Simple, functional, built to last. She asked you to tell me. She said to let you know it was coming so you'd have time to think, not pressure. Information, he understood the distinction. Had come to rely on it as one of the consistent markers of how Sandra operated when she was operating at her best. Tell her I'm already thinking, he said. Thomas made the note. The dedication was the first Saturday of October. Not a large event. Not a spectacle. The residents had moved in across the preceding 2 weeks, and by dedication day, the building already had the smell of cooking and laundry and lived-in spaces, which was the best thing Ryan could have walked into that morning, better than any ceremony. He stood in the lobby with Maisie beside him, and the building already doing what it was built to do. Maisie was in her good coat, navy, purchased at the start of fall when she'd outgrown the blue puffer and had opinions about what replaced it. She had her notebook, in which she'd been drawing buildings since February with increasing structural specificity. She looked at the lobby ceiling. It's high, she said. 12 feet? Why 12? The Residents Association asked for it. They wanted the spaces to feel open. She nodded and wrote something in the notebook. A woman came through the front door with 2 children. A boy around 8, a girl around 4, who was already moving toward the community room with total conviction about where she was going. The woman paused when she saw Ryan. Her name was Carol. Southwest corner, 2nd floor. She looked at him the way people looked at someone, when the thing they wanted to say might not have sufficient words, but the saying of it mattered more than the adequacy. My daughter's heating bill last January was $280, she said. 1-bedroom apartment. I read the project specifications. I read what your design is expected to do for energy retention in these units. She paused. I wanted you to know, I read them. He didn't say it was just engineering. He didn't deflect. He'd learned, across 3 years of carrying things quietly, that there was a form of deflection that came from genuine humility, and a form that came from not believing you deserved to receive something, and that these were not the same thing, and he was still learning to know the difference. I'm glad it's yours, he said. She nodded and went after her children, the 4-year-old already visible through the community room window, spinning in the middle of the empty floor with her arms out. Maisie watched. She was nice. Yeah, is that the southwest corner one? He looked at her. He hadn't told her specifically, only mentioned once that one of the families had been waiting a long time. How did you know that? Maisie looked philosophical about it. You always sound different when something's important. You talked about the southwest corner like it mattered more. He held her gaze for a moment. Sometimes you thought you were shielding your child from the weight of things, and what you were actually doing was teaching them to read the weight precisely. You're very perceptive, he said. I know, she said, without ego. Just confirmation of a known fact. She looked at her notebook. I'm going to draw this room. Go ahead, he said. Sandra arrived at 10 with George, who took a position near the entrance while she walked through the building. Ryan joined her on the 2nd floor, not arranged, just timing, and they walked the hallway together without a schedule between them. She opened the door to Unit 2C. The last one not yet occupied, empty still, catching the morning light. She stood in the center of the main room and looked at the southwest exposure. The insulation values on this face, she said, highest in the building. The corner unit takes the most wind exposure, so the spec needed to compensate. Sister David Cole, she looked. At the angle of October light coming through it, he stood in the room with her and thought about everything that had traveled between a December afternoon in a café and this October morning, and could not reduce it to a line. It wasn't a line. It was the full complicated thing. The slap and the scar and the folder on the table, and a 6-year-old standing in frozen ground with her arms out, and a patent sitting in a digital drawer for 3 years, and a man who knocked on a study door at 9:47 because some things required accounting, and an email with 8 sentences and no performance in any of them, and a building going up through a Chicago winter, holding the way things held when someone had gotten the math right. He couldn't reduce it. He didn't try. It's a good building, Sandra said. Yeah, he said. It is. She turned from the window. Her expression was the one she wore when there was nothing to manage. Not the boardroom version, not the public version. The version that existed when the room was empty and the work was done and there was nothing left to perform for anyone. I've been thinking about what Maisie said at the groundbreaking, she said. That sorry has to go with fixing it. He waited. I've been trying to figure out if the category of thing I did is the kind that has a fixed version, or if it's more of a continued version. Something you keep working on rather than something you complete. She paused. I don't know the answer to that yet. He thought about it honestly before he answered, because she'd offered it honestly, and it deserved the same in return. I don't think the answer matters as much as the direction, he said. You can spend a long time asking yourself if you've arrived somewhere, or you can just keep moving and see where you get. She looked at him. That's going to stay with me, she said quietly. Good, he said. Not warm exactly, just true. They stood in the empty room with the October light coming through the southwest window, and around them the sound of the building being lived in. Footsteps overhead, the particular acoustic of children. Moving freely through space that belonged to them, the dense ordinary sound of a building, doing what it was built to do. Below in the lobby, George was standing by the community board the residents had already begun filling, schedules, introductions, a child's drawing that had been laminated and pinned up in the center. He'd been looking at it for longer than he probably realized. Maisie's voice from somewhere below. Dad! Ryan looked at Sandra. She gestured toward the door. They went. He found Maisie in the community room, with her notebook open, sitting cross-legged on the floor. The 4-year-old from Carol's family was beside her in the same position, watching, with the complete attention of a child observing someone older do something she intended to learn. Maisie was drawing the lobby from memory, the 12-foot ceiling, the light fixture, the angle of the entrance. The proportions were approximately right in the way that suggested it wasn't approximate at all. He crouched beside her. Soven. She showed him the drawing without being asked. In it she had added 2 figures, one taller, with the serious expression she always drew for him, the one that looked like it was paying careful attention to something specific, the other smaller, beside the first, holding a notebook of her own. That's you, Maisie said, pointing to the taller one. I know. She pointed to the other. That's me. I see that. We're both inside, she said. In the building, he looked at the 2 figures standing inside the space that had been a staked outline in February and a foundation in March, and now held 12 families in October. He looked at his daughter who had drawn them inside it as if this were the most natural conclusion available. As if the whole shape of the past year had been pointing here, toward this room, toward these 2 figures standing together in a place they'd helped make real. She was right. They were both inside. That was exactly where they were. He kissed the top of her head. She leaned into him for 1 second, brief, certain, the way she did it, and then straightened up and added another line to the drawing. The 4-year-old beside her pointed at the notebook. Me? Maisie considered the commission with the seriousness of an artist evaluating a request. She looked at the girl, looked at the drawing, found the space. Okay, she said, and drew a 3rd figure, small arms extended wide, placed in the center of the lobby floor, spinning, just spinning. George was still at the community board when they came back through the lobby. He'd stepped back slightly from it, but his eyes were still on the laminated drawing pinned at the center. A child's drawing of 3 figures, a tall one, a smaller one, and one in the middle with arms out to its sides. He looked at it for another moment. Then he looked at Ryan, who had Maisie beside him, and the notebook under her arm. And Carol's 4-year-old still trailing them, with the persistence of someone who had decided she was part of this group now. George's expression was the one Ryan had first seen in the café on Halstead, the one he hadn't had the bandwidth to interpret then. He could read it now. It was the expression of a man who had been carrying something for 2 years and had finally found the right place to set it down. He gave Ryan a single nod. Ryan gave one back. Outside, Chicago was October. The lake was steel gray and vast, and the wind off it carried the beginning of what winter would eventually become. The elevated train was moving somewhere in the middle distance, its sound familiar and continuous, the sound of a city that had been going for a long time and intended to keep going, regardless of what happened inside any of its buildings or cafes or apartments or vacant lots on any given day. And in a building on the south side that had been a vacant lot for 11 years, and a patent in a digital file for 3, and a calculation on a screen for longer than that. In a community room on the ground floor, with the heat holding at exactly the value the specification said it would. A man crouched beside his daughter while she drew the place they were standing in. The scar on his wrist caught the October light coming through the window. He didn't look at it. He didn't need to. Some things you carry long enough that they stop being weight and start being simply part of you. The shape of what you've passed through, the record of what you chose not to let stop you. Not a wound anymore, not a story you tell. Just the mark of a specific night on a specific highway, and everything that had been required of him since, and everything he had found himself equal to. On the refrigerator at home, held up by a magnet from a pizza place that had closed 2 years ago, was a drawing in yellow. A sunburst in human shape, no features, just the color of someone who had been loved so specifically that absence had its own form. He'd looked at it this morning before they left, the way he looked at it every morning. And he'd thought, for the first time without the ache of it being the primary thing, that Laura would have been unsurprised by this, by the building, by Maisie and her notebook and the very specific way she was about things, by the fact that he had kept going in the direction of the work and eventually, the work had opened up and let him back in. She would not have been surprised. She had always known what he was. He watched Maisie draw. The city kept moving. The building held.